Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. Before we get into today's episode, I have an incredibly important announcement that I am so excited to tell you guys about. Okay, so first of all, you already know about Energenesis. I am sure at this point you've heard me talk about it. This is the most cutting edge mitochondrial enhancement supplement, really energy supplement on the market. This is about long-term energy. It's about real energy. It's about building up genuine cellular energy in your body, building up your own body's capacity to produce energy at the cellular level. Okay, that's what this is about. Hopefully you're already taking it. It's amazing. If you're not already taking it, get on it. I have now added an additional supplement to the product line, and it is called Ultra Brain, and it is amazing. I've had so many people just in the last 2-3 weeks since it's been out, the Energy Blueprint members who heard about it first, just raving about how amazing they're feeling literally within days, a few days of taking this. This has an incredible list of ingredients and the dosages that are actually real doses of these ingredients. Rhodiola rosea, amazing science on it showing literally within a week or two, we're talking 40-50% reductions in fatigue, 40-30% reductions in scores of depression. Lion's mane mushroom, 30-40% reductions in depression and anxiety. There's research to back that up. Alpha GPC and choline CDP, these are choline sources that have proven results in the context of cognitive decline and dementia. Bacopa and ginkgo extracts have proven neuroprotective effects and cognitive enhancing effects, brain boosting effects. Neurofactor, which is an extract from coffee fruit, has been shown to boost brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels. Low BDNF levels have been linked to depression and other conditions associated with cognitive decline and poor mood and low neuroplasticity. Saffron extract has been compared to antidepressants, has been compared to anti-Alzheimer's drugs. To say it in a sort of underwhelming fashion, it has performed incredibly well relative to those different drugs for those different conditions. Polygala tenuifolia is another brain energy boosting compound, and N-acetyltyrosine, dopamine boosting compound. And zogenol pine bark extract is a patented pine bark extract that has specifically been shown to enhance cognitive function. And magnesium taurate, which is the most highly bioavailable form of magnesium for the brain. This is honestly just an incredible supplement. Let me read you just a couple of the testimonials that I've gotten from people in just the last few days. Like I said, I've been blown away by the feedback I've been getting. This one's from Jason. He said, I've tried a number of nootropics, including Qualia, and Ultra Brain is the best I have ever tried. I've only used it for 2 days, but looking forward to trialing it over a longer period of time. Here's one from Maureen. She said, I started mine 4 days ago, and I can tell a difference in my energy levels already with just 4 capsules, which, by the way, is less than half the dose. Here's one from Christina, just a few days after starting. She's asking me, Ari, will Ultra Brain be in stock for at least a few months? I don't want to hoard, but I also don't want to run out, ever. And then she says, thank you for such an amazing supplement. I'm so hopeful that for me, this will be the long-term key component that's been missing. Here's one from Beth. She said, I really love Ultra Brain. I've only been taking it for a little more than a week, and yet I began noticing lessened depression, less anxiety, and remembering more already. Thank you so much for offering this product. So I've gotten so many more messages like this. Really, people are noticing profound effects in just a matter of days. So this is the real deal, folks. This is a brain supplement that I really believe is pretty much the best on the market, especially when it comes to mood support for combating depression and anxiety. I mean, it's just packed with compounds supported by clear science showing profound, amazing benefits, amazing reductions in depression and anxiety, and amazing improvements in overall brain health and cognitive function and focus. Just literally within a few days or weeks of taking it. And I've combined so many of those different compounds into this one formula. It's just epic. There'll be a link below this video if you're on YouTube to get it, or go to the energyblueprint.com/ultrabrain and you can get it there. So go pick yourself up a bottle or 3 or 5. It's very possible I could sell out quickly. So go grab yours. Again, the energyblueprint.com/ultrabrain. Ultra Brain. Now, go enjoy this episode of the podcast. Hey there, this is Ari, and welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. In this episode, we are talking to my friend and renowned and leading functional medicine practitioner, Dr. Datis Kharrazian, who is he's almost got a mythical status in the functional medicine realm for how much pioneering work he's done in this field, especially when it comes to brain health. And in this interview / presentation, he is going to be presenting a lot of his absolute best tips and strategies for improving your brain health. So welcome, Dr. Kharrazian.
Yeah, as always, pleasure, Ari. Thanks for having me.
So to start us off, let's talk about your big picture paradigm of the role of the brain in energy levels. So there's lots of different mechanisms and paradigms that are out there. You know, there's people talking about limbic system dysfunction. There's people talking about childhood trauma. There's the polyvagal theory with Stephen Porges and, you know, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. There's people talking about, you know, more the psychological angle of negative beliefs and thought patterns. There's glial excitotoxicities, there's toxins in the glymphatic system, there's neurotransmitters, there's all these different layers of mechanisms and things that we could talk about as far as the role of the brain in how it impacts energy levels and mood, which kind of overlap. But what's your big picture kind of paradigm of the role in the brain, the role of the brain in relationship to energy levels?
So all the things you talk about, like dysautonomia, neuroinflammation, and synaptic activity and neurodegeneration, they're all part of it. But fundamentally, you know, as a clinician, one of the things that I think most people see is that a patient comes in and one of their chief complaints is their fatigue. And one of the quickest things to do as a clinician is to go, is this brain-based fatigue or is this metabolic fatigue? And there's a difference between the two. Brain-based fatigue is a type of fatigue that shows up when a person uses the brain. So when someone says, hey, when I drive, I just need to take a nap. When I start reading, I can't go past I can't get through a chapter. That's brain-based fatigue. And that's different than metabolic fatigue. Metabolic fatigue, you know, they just are tired for no reason throughout the day. And some people have both. But I think there's a lot of people that really have brain fatigue and they get treated for like adrenal dysfunctions and all these metabolic things. And really, ultimately, what they really need to do is get their brain healthier. And that's one of the key immediate things I would like to, you know, kind of when you look at the big picture, first of all, what are you dealing with? And brain fatigue is a red flag of something going wrong with how the brain's metabolism is working. And then all the things you brought up then have to be dissected out to see what's the cause of it.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Is there any overlap between these two things? Like, for example, you know, there are certain people out there who are in the chronic fatigue syndrome niche, and they've promoted a theory of, you know, that the brain is very central to chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's specifically stress and trauma that kind of rewires the brain, the limbic system, especially in a way that promotes, you know, very physical fatigue. I guess you might call it metabolic fatigue, in addition to, you know, maybe brain related symptoms. What do you see as the overlap there?
Well, there's definitely a vicious cycle back and forth between the two. For sure, metabolic fatigue is going to cause brain fatigue. You know, the key thing about the brain is that the brain is one of the tissues in the body that's called post-mitotic tissue. It doesn't go through cell division any further. So once you're born, the amount of neurons you have in your brain, that's it. Now, those neurons can either connect with each other and develop plasticity, but the total quantity of neurons you get is what you're born with. And that's different than other tissues in the body. So like your liver's always regenerating, your gut regenerating, your kidneys regenerating, all your organ systems are constantly regenerating, but your brain, the amount of neurons you have are what you have. And when you have like a chronic inflammatory metabolic disease, like inflammatory bowel syndrome or something, there's going to be a toll it takes on the brain, because systemic inflammation is going to cause brain inflammation and promote neurodegenerative mechanisms. And then what people sometimes forget is the reason they're not feeling better or recovering out of their chronic fatigue is because the brain's in trouble. And now when the brain's in trouble, depending on the region of the brain, if the frontal motor areas are a problem, then using your arms and exercising is going to be fatiguing for you. If your autonomic centers, the basic ganglia that control your limbic system, are a problem, then you have dysautonomia and abnormal heart rates, and anything that raises your blood pressure is going to cause you to be fatigued. it all depends if your occipital lobe is involved, watching TV with quick flashes of screens. So one of the things, once we see someone that does have brain-related fatigue, there's a couple questions you ask. What areas of the brain are involved? And then what are the mechanisms causing it? So you could have someone that fatigues when it's really bright and they don't have their sunglasses and the brain is cooked. That's a different area of the brain than someone who fatigues when they read versus someone who fatigues if they're in a windy road. The one's a vestibular system, one's an occipital lobe, one's involved with autonomic centers for people with constriction dilation. So literally you can listen to a patient, listen to their symptoms and get fine-tuned. And usually patients say, oh, it's so weird, but when I do this, this is really what I notice the symptom. But that's specific to regions of the brain.
Mhm.
So you can
Interesting. So how separate are these different manifestations as far as the causes? And for context, like we could look at, obesity, diabetes, insulin resistance, high blood pressure, dysregulated blood lipids, metabolic syndrome. All of these things are largely different manifestations of a lot of the same root causes at the nutrition and lifestyle level. How much of that same type of thing is going on with these different regions of brain dysfunction that you're describing? Is it the same set of root causes, or is it totally different root causes depending on how it manifests?
Right. It's a good question. So the first thing is all the things you mentioned, all those metabolic conditions, all those inflammatory conditions, all promote neurodegeneration, well established in clinical research. So the question is then why do certain areas show up and other areas show up? So that goes back to some fundamental concepts of actually, your personal neurodevelopment. So each of us have different regions of a brain which have greater connectivity, greater plasticity than other areas, right? So, for example, let's say you're a kid and you grew up and you try to play sports and you were bad at it and you were uncoordinated, but you were just developing, you were a kid, but people started making fun of you and then you never played sports and you always avoided sports forever. Then your vestibular motor system is not going to develop. So you have maybe a less efficient system. So maybe then you excelled at math. Or it could be the opposite. Maybe you were terrible at math, so you avoided all math and then focused on sports your whole life growing up. So during that neurodevelopment state, you have different areas of your brain that have greater plasticity than others. Now, when you have that as a baseline, everyone has different degrees of greater function and greater connectivity in certain regions based on how they exercise or use their brains. Now, when you overlap an inflammatory metabolic condition on top of that, let's say like diabetes, well, the areas are, you're going to have neurodegeneration, neuroinflammation throughout the brain. But the areas that show up first are the areas that have less plasticity.
Mm,
So if you
interesting.
were the person who didn't have a very developed motor, coordinated muscular system because you never played sports,
Mhm.
well, you might end up with your neurodegeneration first showing up with vertigo and dizziness and instability. For someone else, maybe it's the other one who didn't do math. They're going to start but not remember phone numbers and remember lists. And so everyone's brain is different. Everyone's brain has different levels of connectivity or plasticity in certain areas. And then when you put a metabolic condition on top of it, the clinical presentations always show up in the first with the least amount of connectivity. So that's why it's different from one person to the next.
Very, very interesting. So as far as how nutrition and lifestyle plays into this,
Mhm.
what do you see? Are there sort of well-defined, more typical root causes at the nutrition and lifestyle level of these conditions, or do you to what degree do you see nutrition and lifestyle as factoring into these brain-related symptoms that you're describing?
Well, they're critical. So I think one of the key things is to first of all, as a person suffering from a condition, chronic condition or fatigue issue, or a clinician trying to figure out patients, so realize what role the brain plays, and then like what are the mechanisms. Well, obviously, inflammation is a key mechanism, but inflammation in the brain is totally different than the rest of the body. So in the brain, we have primarily neuroglial cells, microglial cells, and they don't have an off switch. Okay, so in our systemic immune system, we have suppressor cells that can shut down the immune system. We don't have T suppressor cells in our brain. We don't have T regulatory cells in the brain, and we have these neuroglial cells in the brain. And then the other key feature of these neuroglia cells, the immune cells of the brain, is that they can get into a physiological state called neuroglial priming, where they don't shut off. As a matter of fact, things like traumatic brain injury that severely impact an area of the brain turns on these glial cells, and then they stay on, and they don't, and they have a heightened state of an inflammatory reaction, and they're triggered by inflammation throughout the body. So you could have also someone who has like head injury, and then their neuroglial cells are already primed, head injury from 10 years ago in a car accident, and now they're starting to get early diabetes, and now they're really getting severe degeneration and symptoms there. So inflammation is a role with like all like just the general concept of how diet lifestyle impacts brain function. But in addition to plasticity in different regions, we'll have different areas of prime glial cells, maybe from past injuries, maybe from past assaults to the brain, maybe someone's hypoxic, had CO2 poisoning, who knows. And then when you add all those up, yes, the underlying cause of all these things is inflammation, but everyone has a different level of glial priming and a different degree of plasticity. So the expressions of it is all different.
Mm-hmm.
But underlying it, you have to treat the inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing is that when people have prime glial cells, there's only certain things that can make a difference for that from a nutritional perspective. For example, you have to take flavonoids that can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you don't take it, some people, for example, have a really nice response to curcumin or resveratrol, but not respond to acai extract or pomegranate extract because, let's say, resveratrol can cross the blood-brain barrier. So some of the reasons why people go, oh, my depression or my energy change could be because of the ability of that natural nutraceutical to cross the blood-brain barrier and then actually turn on the glial cells.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it gets really exciting when you think about inflammation, that the immune system in the brain is different than the rest of the body. And then in order to even get those cells from a nutraceutical point of view, there's only so many things that can cross the blood-brain barrier, right?
Interesting. I want to come back to the nutraceutical aspect of things and phytochemicals that do that effectively. But is there a point at which all of these different mechanisms converge into some of the same pathways? So what I mean is, you mentioned a number of different potential causes of how the brain could start to dysfunction. Everything from, toxic exposure, heavy metals, or carbon monoxide poisoning, or something like that, to head injury, to, I'm sure, just poor diet, to being sedentary, to I'm sure there's probably 10 other things that you could list off.
Yeah.
Do they do they converge through this inflammatory pathway and some of the and the glial overexcitement? Is it possible to sort of say there is a general pattern of excessive inflammation and glial excitotoxicity that results from almost all of these different causes, and that may manifest differently for different people depending on their genetics, their unique causes, their personality development, as you described, different plasticity differences. But do they converge in at some of the same biochemical mechanisms at some point?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, like you said, inflammation is where everything merges that then triggers all these different cascading events downstream, right? But the other unique thing about the brain is when you look at the brain, there's two types of cells in the brain. There's neurons, and then there's the glial cells. And glial cells are immune, and neurons are what branch into each other and have electrical activity. So, inflammation will definitely turn on these glial cells in the brain that can promote a neurodegenerative process. And some people have different degrees of prime glial cells. But then something unrelated to inflammation is just activity of the brain. So, neurons make mitochondria within them for their ATP production only after they're stimulated. So your they call mitochondrial biogenesis in neurons or even in muscles throughout the body, and the brain specifically take place from activation. So your brain actually literally, unrelated to inflammation, as a common area, because the brain is unique that it needs stimulation also. So you need to reduce inflammation, it needs activation. So when you stop using different regions of the brain, it degenerates. As a matter of fact, these neuroglial cells that are involved with inflammation, their normal job is to get rid of dead cells and debris in the brain. When neurons stop firing, they just start chewing them up.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay, so it becomes a neurodegenerative process in areas of the brain that are not as active as they should be.
right. So we tend to kind of focus on certain things we're good at and like to do. And as we get older, those start to show up, especially if you have an underlying metabolic inflammatory disease, which adds fuel to the fire. So what's very unique about the brain is, of course, inflammation is a burgeoning area, but one of the most overlooked areas is activation and stimulation.
You're speaking my language now, because hormesis is my favorite subject, and transient metabolic stress and how that affects mitochondria. But to some extent, what you're talking about here, I'm sure there's a hormetic element, but there's also just like challenging areas of your brain that you may not making conscious efforts to, for example, do math or do crossword puzzles or do things that you wouldn't normally do. Is that accurate?
It's accurate. So like goes to the point, like let's say, for example, someone is tired all the time, they're fatigued and they're exhausted, and they know when they drive in a windy road or that really fatigues them. And that's all vestibular, right? That's the vestibular system trying to figure out where you are in space in relation to the environment. So for them, like they're gonna have to do vestibular rehabilitation to get their brain function back. They can take all the nutraceuticals in the world. It's not gonna make those neurons develop mitochondria and develop plasticity, only activation will. Inflammation will promote it. And if you reduce inflammation, it can slow down the process, but it's not going to make neurons connect, and it's not going to make neurons have mitochondria. The person who's good at math, that is bad at math, and now every time they try to do calculations or math or timeline, they get really tired and get fatigued. They're going to have to start doing math. They're staying in very basic level 101 brain rehabilitation. Whatever they can't do is what they do.
Is what they should do.
Is there therapy?
In other words, yeah.
If balance is bad, you do balance. If you can't do finger to your nose because you keep missing your nose, you do your finger to nose.
Got it. Yeah. Fascinating. I never thought about it quite like that. So, okay. So there's seems like there's two elements here, and I'm sure this is still oversimplifying, but one element is this sort of personalized element depending on, that depends on individual assessment and identification of, which parts or systems of the brain are not adequately stimulated or underactivated and don't have adequate degrees of neuroplasticity and are prone to this sort of neurodegenerative process that you've described. And then the other aspect of it is, maybe more universal recommendations as far as nutrition and lifestyle that we know decreases inflammation in the brain and supports optimal brain function and brain cell health. Is that accurate to say?
It's accurate, yeah.
Okay. So granted, given that we're doing this interview and we have tens of thousands, hopefully a couple 100,000 people listening to this, who are unfortunately don't in this moment have the luxury of sitting across from you in your office where they can get a personalized assessment. My first question, I want to dig into the universal stuff and recommendations, nutrition and lifestyle stuff, but are there any aspects of assessments that someone could do at home, sort of on their own? And obviously there's no substitution for seeing someone like you in person, but is there any way that someone could sort of self-assess and identify, hey, these parts of my brain maybe are underactive?
There is. So let me give you a general answer. And so when I wrote a book called Why Isn't My Brain Working? And then in the beginning of each chapter, I wrote the symptoms of different mechanisms of dysfunction for different of the brain. So you could have lack of brain function from a blood sugar issue or from a neuroinflammation issue or from a blood-brain permeability issue or from a gut-brain axis issue. So there's different symptoms that present each one. My attempt to try to share more of a specific application to it was to write a book and break it down by chapter with symptoms in each chapter for each section. So that was one way to do it.
I actually have that book in the cabinet right behind me. I should have got it out, but it's a phenomenal book and it's filled with all my notes and highlights all over the place.
So that was an attempt for me to try to teach people that, when you look at your brain, there's so many different things that can go wrong and so many different mechanisms. And here's how you can kind of fine tune which ones may be involved with you. And here's the research of how you can change these things. And then once I wrote my brain book, I had a lot of people contact us. It's a great book. I read it, but I have so much brain dysfunction. I can't even get through it. It's hard to understand. And then made a video program called Save Your Brain, online program. It's at Dr. K News, but it really goes into a step-by-step approach. And I teach people how to do their own physical neurological exam and look at symptoms and kind of figure out which exercises to do. But for the most part, you kind of think of it front to back of the brain. Like if you have a hard time with math, then get a math app and start doing multiplication tables and games that, I don't know, elementary school people are learning to do, or that can really help you. If you have a really hard time with directions and people's faces and shapes, then do games like Tetris where you're looking at shapes and trying to fit them into different spots. If you close your eyes and put your feet together and see if you sway or how your balance is, or stand on one foot and close your eyes. If your balance is off, you got to do some balance exercises. Those are the most common things is just, left, right brain and balance. I mean, you can get to the very fine-tuned areas of each region of the brain if you had a chance to do an exam. But those are the, general guidelines. And for the most part, If you're highly active and doing multitask exercise where you're hitting a tennis ball, running, timing, planning, those are like fantastic ways to keep your brain healthy from aging, whether it's tennis or ping pong or basketball. Um, so those are important to do. And then cognitive things like you should try to learn a language. You should try to keep your brain active and stimulated. Definitely, just watching TV passively is not good for the brain.
Mhm.
So those types of activities make a big difference. Be an athlete, be a scholar, keep your brain healthy, keep your inflammation down, and then that's the way to preserve your brain.
Mhm. Excellent. So I want to dig into nutrition and lifestyle aspects here. I know in your book you talk a lot about a lot of things. It's a gigantic book. I think what is it, 600 pages or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But
Um,
a lot of references in the back, so it's not as
yeah. So blood sugar regulation is a big issue as far as brain related issues. Stress, sleep, circulation is something that you talk about. The brain gut axis. Um, what do you think? I'm sure all of these are pretty common, but if you were to say, hey, here are the three most common causes of why someone would have brain related fatigue, or the five most common causes of why someone would have brain related fatigue as far as nutrition and lifestyle factors, what would be that list for you?
okay. Well, gosh, that's a tough question. Okay, number one for sure in the current U.S. population is going to be blood sugar stability. So and that could include like being pre-diabetic, diabetic, or being hypoglycemic with blood sugar levels drop. So blood sugar roller coaster rides are going to devastate the brain. And one of the things that when your blood sugar levels, when a person eats too much carbohydrates or too much sugar, or they're pre-diabetic, they pump out more insulin, and insulin just turns on these neuroglial cells in the brain, causes significant inflammation, and really promotes the neurodegenerative process and just daily function of the brain, and uncouples mitochondria bioenergetics to be efficient. And you really can't use the brain. The brain dysregulates. Then people that get low blood sugar, they're the ones when the blood sugar is low, the brain doesn't have fuel, and even when their blood sugar levels drop, there's an insulin surge as an attempt for the body to get glucose into the cells for whatever it can, and those create the inflammatory cascade. So number one is blood sugar, and for me, I would say the first thing that I ask my patients to determine if they have a blood sugar issue is, how do you feel after you eat?
Hmm.
And the normal response would be, I just don't feel like I'm hungry. If there's any symptom change of energy, then I know there's a blood sugar problem. So hypoglycemics will typically say, oh, I feel like I can function again. I feel better. I can think again. I'm not angry anymore. That's a sign that they're dealing with a low blood sugar roller coaster, right? And those that eat a meal and need to take a nap and crave sugar or need to immediately have a coffee, those are insulin resistance people who's getting insulin surges. They tend to be on the pre-diabetic side. So the normal response is you should actually be hungry, have an appetite, eat, no longer be hungry, but no change in energy and function.
Mhm.
So that's number one. Number two, um, the key thing that really promotes a neurodegenerative response, since you're making me come up with five, most common.
I'm sure you could come up with 20 if you think hard
No,
enough.
it's hard to pick which one's like the top one. I'd say the second one is going to be activation of the brain. Like if a person doesn't activate the brain, it's going to neurodegenerate. By activation of the brain, let's just stick to cognitive aspects. Like you really should be challenging your brain. Some people play Sudoku, some people do word puzzles. That is fantastic, but you really need to do activation of do things to activate your brain. If they're watching your summit, then they're stimulating their brain by learning, and if they're reading a book or if they're focused on some topic to explore and learn, those are critical for it. But a lot of people just have neurodegenerative changes because they don't use their brain anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting that as you're saying that, I realize this is something that I've neglected in my thinking about these subjects. For example, in the context of neurodegenerative disease, I tend to just really think more in the context of nutrition and lifestyle factors and stress and disrupted circadian rhythm and sleep and poor diet and poor gut health and so on. But the stimulation aspect, it's interesting to hear you describe it as number two, as being so important. And I'm just curious if you were to, this is a really tough question, I'm sure you can't accurately answer, but just your hunch about what percentage of the overall neurological disease problem you perceive to be related to just a population that just doesn't use their brain very much and challenge themselves to learn and to stimulate these different parts of the brain.
Oh, I think it's a large percentage of the population, especially once people are not in a position to challenge their brains anymore.
Mm.
We first go to school, we learn the language, we get thrown in physical PE, maybe not anymore, thrown into music, and that's very stimulating for the brain, right? So, but once we get older, we kind of lose those things and we get focused on doing the same task every day and the same focus every day. And then if you're not stimulating your brain will degenerate. And the
Mhm.
areas of the brain you're not using will have less mitochondria in them and they have less plasticity in them. So they'll have fatigue sooner when you start to use them. So, it's like someone that maybe their midlife career, they go back in school, the first week of going back to school, they're sleeping 10 hours a day because their brain's so tired because they're not used to reading and studying and everything. But
Mhm.
you're actually doing is saving the brain. So lack of activation, I think, is common, especially as we get older. Now, some people are in a profession where they're using their brain all the time, and that's actually very good for them and keeps them healthy. And when you look at patients that come in, you see that a 75-year-old, 90-year-old that's still highly functional, they were constantly using the brain and they were constantly doing things. And you see people retire and all of a sudden everything goes downhill. They're not using the brain anymore. So you
Yeah.
have to use your brain. You have to challenge your brain to stay healthy.
Yeah.
Even there's all these apps today and online programs. People go in and learn to challenge themselves with puzzles and games. They do that 20, 30 minutes a day. That's really a good idea.
Mhm. Excellent. Fascinating stuff. So, okay. So blood sugar dysregulation and brain stimulation, number 1 and 2, where would you go from here?
The third one has to be physical activity. It's another common one that people just don't do, and it really impacts their brain function. And physical exercise is one of the few things that causes neuronal branching. And neuronal branching, and especially with runners, there's been some phenomenal research that shows that runners, in particular, the most studied, when they run, their neurons branch so aggressively, and they release things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which allows these neurons to connect, and that runner's high creates this opioid response, and that sets the stage on for major neuron branching and growth and calms down the inflammatory response. So I'd say getting an exercise high feeling turns on all the biochemistry to really protect the brain.
Hmm. This is kind of a weird thing on one hand. Like it's counterintuitive, but I think everybody's seen over the last 5 years, 10 years, there's been a number of articles in the media about exercise improves brain health and combats depression, combats neurological disease, things like that. So I think a lot of us have heard that exercise is good for our brain, and we accept that. On the other hand, it's kind of a weird and counterintuitive thing in my view, because it's like, and my background's in exercise, so I'm used to thinking of like exercise is good for your muscles, and we can study all the ways that muscles adapt in terms of strength and endurance and muscle fiber type and mitochondrial biogenesis in the muscles and muscle hypertrophy and yada yada yada. Um, but it's like, okay, well, why does doing bicep curls and strengthening your bicep muscles, just as an example, or doing squats or going for a run, why would that, from an evolutionary perspective, boost our brain health?
Well, I'm not sure from an evolution perspective, but for sure, just doing bicep curls is immediately going to raise things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor to allow connectivity, and you're going to boost your antioxidant production throughout your body, including the brain, and you're going to increase circulation and blood flow because when you do a bicep curl, you're actually activating your homunculus distribution of your motor and premotor areas and spinosensory cortex to fire and integrate for you to the activation. So it's very stimulating to the brain. So what's not something in the brain is just sitting around like watching YouTube videos and watching TV and eating inflammatory food and
Mhm.
so I think so on the list of the most common things that cause neurodegeneration and make the brain not preserve itself as we get older is just not getting physical activity. The brain gets activated if you physical activity you do, whether it's a bicep curl or you're running, you're playing basketball, is integrating different regions of your brain.
Mm.
And after exercise and during exercise, you need lots of increased circulation and blood flow to the brain, which keeps your neurons healthy. So it's
Fascinating.
critical. So
So to what degree do you think that it's important just to do exercise and sort of get a workout, or versus like using your body to learn a physical skill? Like one of the activities that I do is rock climbing, and rock climbing is this very unique mix of yes, it absolutely can be a workout, can be very intense at times, but a lot of times it's this act, this art of you're using your body like you're playing a chess game, like you're using your body to figure out how to solve problems in physical space and how to manipulate your body movements to be stable in a particular position to get to that next position up the wall.
Exactly.
So like so what, to what degree are the benefits from the sort of like working out, like getting a workout versus like moving your body, learning how to move your body in new different ways and
Right.
kind of coordinating that?
That's a great question. So, like for example, if you're learning how to mountain climb, a rock climb, you're activating a lot of fine motor coordination activities, your balance, your shift in weight. That is a tremendous stimulus to your brain. And if someone's in shape, they may fatigue their brain before they fatigue their body when they first learn how to rock climb. So they get done and they're like, I'm so tired. But it's not their body that needs recovery, it's their brain. They need to just like close their eyes and shut down. So
Hmm.
that is helping connectivity in that specific region of motor planning, coordination, body shifting. And that's one thing. So the type of activities you do can fatigue your brain when you're doing exercise, but also very therapeutic for your brain. So if someone had um, some frontal lobe degeneration or dysfunction, rock climbing would be very difficult for them because they can't get that motor planning that's very much involved with that type of activity. Running would be a lot easier because they just kind of do the same thing over again, sequence. It's not as cognitive of a task, but it's also not as therapeutic. So one part of it is the specific types of activities you do will activate different regions versus others. So if you're constantly doing exercise on a Bosu ball or a unstable platform, that's more vestibular, right? Um, just doing dumbbell curls in the same motion is not going to have as much stimulation in your coordination integrated path as your brain. So that's one thing. And then, but the other thing is your heart rate. So when they look at brain research, they have a direct relationship between the intensity of the exercise and changing the neurochemistry of the brain. What they find is bursts of high intensity do have a different impact on the biochemistry of the brain.
Mm.
So one part of it is the chemistry of it, and one part of it is the connectivity of it. So the actions you do are going to impact the connectivity and plasticity of it, and then how high your heart rate gets during the activity will change the biochemistry. So higher heart rate equals more blood flow, more circulation, more growth factors, more brain-derived neurotrophic factors. That's related to how high your heart rate is. But then the more coordinated your activities are, the more connectivity you get in those areas of the brain. So, when we work with patients that have brain injuries, sometimes we have to pick exercises. Like if you gave a patient that had a brain injury in their vestibular system, the balance centers of the cerebellum, some exercises on a Bosu ball with the bicep curl, they'd be tired and exhausted maybe before the muscles were tired because the brain was.
Wow.
They may not make that connection.
Hmm.
They think, oh my God, I'm so tired, I'm so out of shape. And they think they're physically out of shape, but it's the brain that's out of shape.
Hmm.
Listen, when the brain fatigues, your muscles don't work anymore, nothing works.
Wow.
That's the concept of brain fatigue because your brain is impacting, controlling everything, right? It's all integrating. So, you know,
This is fascinating stuff. I'm loving this conversation. So, one other thing I think is worth mentioning here. We're obviously focused very much on the fatigue energy aspect of things, but would you say it's accurate to say that basically all of these same constellation of issues are also the major causes of neurological disease more broadly?
oh, absolutely.
Okay.
These are all risk factors and mechanisms that promote neurodegenerative disease. Yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
I want to make that connection for people listening in so that they understand like these are really the same factors. Like if you want to avoid dementia and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other neurological diseases, it's really, and keep your brain healthy as you get older, it comes back to these same things. So optimizing your brain, I'm curious if you would agree with this, optimizing your brain for energy is very much the same thing as optimizing your brain for disease prevention and having good brain health well into old age.
Yeah, you can even say it's identical.
Okay.
They overlap.
Got it.
Yeah.
So we've got blood sugar dysregulation, we've got exercise, we've got stimulation, brain stimulation, and we've got exercise.
Yeah. Fourth on the list is going to be sleep. Your brain cannot function in sleep deprived states. Your brain cannot branch. It can't develop plasticity. It can't get rid of debris when it's in a sleep deprived state. And studies have clearly show when people don't get enough sleep, they monitor them over time, there's difference in brain volume sizes, and it promotes atrophy of the brain. So, like we think, well, I can rough through it. I can have the alarm wake me up and I can get through it. And then I can, take the stimulant to keep me going. But that actually changes your brain to a point where it can't develop connectivity and plasticity, and it can't get rid of these debris. So we all get debris in our brain from dead cells that are dying off, whether it's beta amyloid or alpha-synuclein or whatever the aggregate protein is. But they build up in our brain. Our body has to clear those out. It can't do that in a sleep-deprived state. So one of the biggest factors that, as you talk about top 5, is just sleep. So when we're working with a patient recovering from a brain injury, or working with a patient that has a neurodegenerative disease and trying to get into a lifestyle, first thing we tell them is you have to get to the point and figure this out. So you wake up without an alarm clock, or your body just has enough rest and then it gets up. Like whether you have to start going to bed at 8 o'clock to make sure you figure out have enough time to do it, but you have to get to the point where you're not stimulated up to have the brain we need to help it recover and to rehabilitate or so forth. So sleep is a major one. I think this is a major problem also for kids, neurodevelopmental issues and so forth. They're just getting not enough sleep. They're so stimulated and wired, and they get up and they have to be forced out of bed. That is a major, major mechanism for causing inefficient brain, and also, like you said, being a factor for neurodegeneration.
This is a bit of a digression, but you mentioned the kid thing, and I just remember seeing an article maybe a year ago or something like that, where they were talking about changing school start times from whatever 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. or 9:30 a.m. or something like that, because they're finding so many kids are sleep deprived and their brains are not functioning early in the morning. So they're awake. They're forcing themselves to wake up with an alarm clock. They're tired. They're not getting enough sleep, and then they're going to school. But in my view, this is really not getting at the root cause of the problem. And this is a bit of a digression, but the root cause of the problem, as I see it, is we live in a modern world that is phase shifting our circadian rhythm to more of a night owl rhythm. And kids are staying up too late due to artificial light, and they're going to bed too late, and then they're being forced to wake up too early. And then I just don't know how much extending school start times actually fixes anything, because now kids are just going to say, oh, I can stay up even later now. And ultimately you're, I think in the long run, making things even worse potentially.
Yeah, ultimately you're right. It's this constant stimulation that's keeping them up at night.
Mm-hmm.
But the whatever the cause is, that has to be addressed. For some people that has neurodegeneration, as they get older, like we can't get their brain healthy until we stop their frequent nighttime urination. For someone else, it's they're stimulating and playing on their iPad all night, and all that light is going to give them a blue light filter and put time limits and get them to read an actual book or do things to fall asleep. For some people, it's their blood sugar. They get hypoglycemic throughout the day, and then they don't eat enough protein, and they wake up in the middle of the night with a hypoglycemic spike, and wake up from the adrenaline rush to try to break down some protein in the body for sugar. But sleep is a major one. Like if you don't get sleep, your brain has no chance. Can't function well, and it's going to neurodegenerate faster.
Yeah. So we've got sleep, we've got exercise, we've got brain stimulation, we've got blood sugar dysregulation. Is there anything else worth mentioning here?
Well, number 5, I want to make number 5 inflammation.
Okay.
So we're talking a lot about inflammation. Inflammation is critical, but everyone has some degree of inflammation, and it's a common point area. And by the way, lack of sleep, lack of physical activity, blood sugar issues, all will increase your inflammatory load. So again, like you're saying, it does converge. But I wanted to make that number 5 because I wanted to kind of highlight the other ones, right? So ultimately, these 5 that you have do converge, and those things all create the inflammatory cascade also. But that being said, sometimes people can get confused and go, okay, so I'm taking my anti-inflammatory nutritional protocol, so I should be okay. Or I eat well, I don't eat junk, I don't eat fast food, so I should be okay. No, if you're not sleeping, you're not getting enough cognitive stimulation, you're still hypoglycemic, your blood sugar is spiking in between your salads or whatever, you're going to have neurodegenerative changes and inefficient brains. So, for me, being a healthcare practitioner, alternative medicine, I see a lot of alternative healthcare practitioners as patients too. And they are eating well, and they are, but they're eating well, but they're still hypoglycemic. They're eating well, they're hypoglycemic, but they still don't get enough rest. They're not stimulating their brain. They're just so caught up in their work and not doing other activities to keep themselves excited about whatever they need to. Maybe they need to learn art uh, or something. So I wanted to highlight those more than just inflammation. However, they all do converge with inflammation.
Yeah, very interesting. I know that there's, I'm sure it's not an exaggeration to say 30 hours at least that you could talk about all the mechanisms of how our brain dysfunction and how to fix it. So this is necessarily kind of a very short summary and oversimplification in some instances. But two other things that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. One is the role of the vagus nerve, and kind of the Stephen Porges model of the polyvagal theory, and also neurotransmitters. There are some people out there who are very brain focused, who just kind of, in my view, kind of reduce everything almost down to neurotransmitter imbalance, and then use specific amino acid supplements, whether it's L-theanine or tryptophan or whatever, to optimize neurotransmitter balance. And that's kind of their whole model, which I think is very, very myopic in compared to the model that you're presenting here. But what are your thoughts on neurotransmitters and the polyvagal theory, vagus nerve, the role of the vagus nerve in all of this?
Well, let's start with neurotransmitters first. Well, there's for sure there's nutraceuticals that impact neurotransmitter activity in the brain. Precursor amino acids can raise certain neurotransmitters. Different botanicals can bind to different receptors for different neurotransmitters in the brain, right? So there's something to be said there, but they're also very superficial band-aid type mechanisms. Like if someone, for example, took some kind of valerian root or hops or passion flower to sleep, that doesn't last. I mean, there's a point where the brain adapts, doesn't work anymore. Someone took L-theanine to help them to raise your GABA levels. They're going to maybe for the first 2 weeks feel something, and then it stops. I mean, there's so my experience is, yeah, those nutraceuticals can be helpful, but they're really short term and they're not really addressing the main issue. And then we know there's no accurate way to really measure neurotransmitters in the brain. The levels of neurotransmitters in the brain are different in different regions at different times. Urinary neurotransmitter testing are not valid. There's no reflection between which region of the brain has different neurotransmitter activities. So it's hard to measure, but it is some people's model. And in my book, I do talk about symptoms related to common neurotransmitter imbalances, but we always put it the last and say, this is the last place you go. Start with blood sugar, you start with these factors, and get rid of all the smoke screen and see if there's any neurotransmitter imbalances left. And then maybe you can kind of boost them that way.
Because ultimately, most neurotransmitter imbalances, even if they are present, are largely related to these same root causes that you've already mentioned.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But sometimes, like, for example, if I want to focus and concentrate and improve recall, and I'm working on a cognitive project, I may take some catecholamine or acetylcholine support during that project to let me focus, right? When you drink coffee, you're getting catecholamines elevated. So that's a neurotransmitter stimulant, for example. Things like huperzine help raise acetylcholine levels. I know when I take it, when I'm trying to do long-term cognitive tasks, it helps me have greater endurance, So they're useful to some degree, but if you overlook the underlying mechanism that causes neurotransmitter imbalances, that's I think where things fall apart. I'm not sure what the polyvagal theory is, so.
Oh, really? So yes, Stephen Porges has been out there for, I think maybe 10 or 20 years at this point. I think the last time I interviewed you, there was a similar thing like this where I mentioned somebody's work and you were like, never heard of it. And it's so funny to me because it just speaks to the fact that you're so immersed in, the research that you just oftentimes don't even pay any attention to kind of what's going on in the popular sort of internet health world.
No, I do not know what's going on. What is the theory?
I don't want to not do it justice and oversimplify, but basically it's conceptualizing a dorsal vagal response and a ventral vagal response. And basically it's a model that says, hey, it's more complex than just, fight or flight, sympathetic mode, stress mode versus rest and digest, parasympathetic mode. The vagus nerve is just more complex than that. And we have this ventral vagus and dorsal vagus response. And there's also this kind of more of a freeze response, and he relates this to fatigue and depression and apathy and things like that. And ventral vagus response is more, it's largely about safety. So safety is a big thing. in this model, where basically to be in a ventral vagal state means your brain is, and your nervous system is, senses that it's in a safe environment. It's not in a stressed, dangerous environment. But yeah, I'm oversimplifying and not describing it well, but I would say that's the kind of the gist of it.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, autonomic system is always more complicated than just sympathetic versus parasympathetic, and I think we're learning more about it. I can't criticize it or comment on it because I just don't have any experience on it. But I would just generally say autonomics. I think for the only way I can answer autonomics from my world and just from my background and my bias and my exposures is we have patients that do have dysautonomias, and we have patients that do have dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system that need to get those systems organized and balanced to have any chance of getting function. So typically we'll see with dysautonomia is like we'll put a heart rate monitor on them and their heart rate is all over the place. Like most people, you put a heart rate monitor on them, just leave it there for a minute or two. You get a resting heart rate and it's pretty stable. For some people, it goes all over the place. It goes from 60 to 110 to 70 to 80, and it's just sitting there. So like, wow, that's dysautonomia. Or look at their pupils, and they're normally people have resting. People are stable with a little bit of activity, but they're just all over the place from one to the other. We'll see vascular changes, blood flow changes. They're typically very sensitive to light or sound. So we see. I mean, for me, my only way to try to answer your question about vagus is I work with patients with dysautonomia, and
but you do use and talk about vagus nerve stimulation as playing a role in brain health.
So for me, I'm not as complex between dissecting ventral versus dorsal. I don't know if in a real physical exam you can do that, but we can look at vagal function, nucleus and vagus function. We can look at blood flow. We can listen to their gut. We can listen to their heart. We can listen for bowel sounds. We can look at their palate when they say ah. If their palate moves, we can see if they have a normal gag reflex. And then if we don't, we can activate those centers by gargling or things like that. I talk about that in my book. But also the autonomic centers. I remember this one time I was like, I think I thought I learned autonomics wrong for the brain, and I think it was updated. So I spent like 3 weeks playing all these papers. I had to do a lecture, an hour and a half, on brain autonomics. So I spent a long time reviewing everything I could find on it, and I'm like, oh my God, it is so complex. There isn't one region in the brain that just autonomic function. Mm-hmm. So the vagal nuclei is the postsynaptic output. So there's the vagus, and there's all these things that are presynaptic to the vagus. So all the different areas in the limbic system, the nucleus accumbens, all the different areas in the temporal and parietal lobe that are involved with somatosensory integration of autonomics, they all end up branching here. So even a vagal dysfunction can be caused by other areas. Like you can have someone that gets a parietal lobe injury from whatever, a sport or car accident, and then from that point on, their heart rate's never the same. They can't digest food anymore. Their bowel movements are off. Their heart rate and anxiety all the time. But it's because, and their vagus could be off ventral or dorsally, but it's that presynaptic input to that region that may be a factor. So I'm limited to brain injuries and vagal points of view from that perspective, but it is a role with many people, though, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So we have a short amount of time left. I want to make sure we get into your top tips, like practical tips. So, you've mentioned a number and alluded to a number of practical tips already, but we've got, again, just to recap, we have blood sugar dysregulation, brain stimulation, exercise, sleep, and I'm forgetting the last one. What does that say about my brain function?
The last one was just inflammation as a general.
There we go, inflammation. So exercise, I think we'll leave alone. Sleep we'll leave alone. But as far as maybe blood sugar dysregulation, I think, mental stimulation you've already covered pretty well as well. Maybe blood sugar dysregulation, if you have a few tips on how people can avoid that. And then I want to get into inflammation and phytonutrients and some of the supplements that you perceive to, or supplements and or nutrition, lifestyle changes that can combat the brain inflammation and some of these mechanisms that are going on that destroy brain cells.
Right. So with brain inflammation, blood sugar issues related to that question, there's always a scale. For some people, all they need to do is stabilize their blood sugar. They're hypoglycemic. They need to not skip meals and keep their blood sugar stable, and they need to avoid those drops where they lose function. So that's like basic 101. Then you go to a deeper level, and then you have people that are not pre-diabetic. For those, they have to get their insulin and blood sugar under control, whether it's physical exercise and eating less carbohydrate-rich glycemic foods. That's the basic. Then you get people that have brain inflammation and they're doing everything right, whether it's a traumatic brain injury or a neuroautoimmunity. And now there's been a lot of good literature on in states of ketosis actually dampening microglial cells and helping MS. There's 2 clinical trials with MS published where it shows it actually helps neuron branching. So we're finding some patients, it's not just getting their insulin down or getting the blood sugar down. They actually have to go into a state of ketosis to actually calm down their brain inflammation, get the blood sugar under control. And that's another level. So there's definitely people that have to go into that degree of dietary change to calm down their brain inflammation and control their blood sugar. And then,
And real quick to that point, is that something that you perceive as like, hey, that you need to be on a keto diet forever, permanently, indefinitely from that point on, or is it something that's more of a temporary solution?
so it depends. If someone has seizure activities, sometimes that's the only way we can get their seizures under control. And as soon as they deviate from ketogenic diet, it happens. We don't have to a theory. It's obvious. Some people throughout the recovery of their brain injury, they have to do it. For most people, they kind of get into ketosis. They get tired of it. They take a break from it. They see how they function. Some people, they're just like, it's not worth it, and I need to stay on it. They'll kind of know when it's their own right time where they can function without it. So we kind of just observe the
Got it.
patient and see how they function and kind of go from there. So there's no general rule as far as how I do it. And then the next level up is they have to do so. The other key thing with blood sugar regulation, how it impacts brain, is intermittent fasting. And even though that's pretty popular, but one of the interesting things about intermittent fasting is when you have those prime glial cells that stay on and turn to an inflammatory state, and you have debris in the brain, you have to promote a physiological state called autophagy, where you get rid of debris and get rid of these prime glial cells. And the only thing that's really been shown to be effective doing that is intermittent fasting. So when it comes to blood sugar issues, there's a spectrum, whether it's just not missing meals or controlling your insulin or getting into ketosis or doing intermittent fasting, or for some people doing intermittent fasting with ketosis, depending on how severe their blood sugar dysfunction is and how much it's impacting their brain inflammation. So it's a scale, right? So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's this, there's also a distinction between prolonged fasting and the daily feeding and fasting window. And my understanding is that if you have an adequate fasting window each night on a daily basis, that in itself would likely take care of the autophagy and brain cleanup aspect of things.
I mean, a common, most popular one, I think, is the 18-6-6 hour feeding window, 18-hour fasting. That has tremendous benefits for brain inflammation and helping with autophagy and so forth.
Got it. But as you said, then there's this other potential, especially if someone goes to such a narrow feeding window. Now you have potential for maybe hypoglycemic episodes if you're not eating enough during the day. And people who are maybe in poor metabolic health, especially if they try to go straight to a 6-hour feeding window, they might experience hypoglycemia for a lot of the day. And that's going to be problematic as well. So do you perceive overall metabolic health and metabolic flexibility as being a big factor here as well?
For sure. And actually, one of the things I do in my own practice is if I need to get a patient to a fasting state to deal with a brain injury or neurodegeneration to promote autophagy, for many of them, I'll actually make sure they can get into ketosis first. And then once they get into ketosis, they get adapted to using ketones as an efficient energy source. That might take them 4 to 6 weeks. And once they get adapted to being in a ketogenic state, they'll just notice themselves fasting longer. And then once the body can actually work in that state, they can function. But to take like a hypoglycemic to intermittent fasting is going to cause serious problems. Like their brain function is going to go down dramatically.
So do it slowly. Like you wouldn't tell somebody who's sedentary, go run a marathon. You'd say, go start with a 5-minute walk and build up from there slowly.
And they could do a 14-hour fast to 15 to 16 to 17. Yeah. And as long as they're not really losing function during their.
Got it. Last question. What would be your top phytonutrients and supplements for optimizing brain function and decreasing brain inflammation and glial overactivation? And I'm sure that in itself is something you could address for a few hours, but like just to list off some of your top supplements and herbs and phytochemicals.
My number one supplement is short-chain fatty acids. And there is an explosion of research on short-chain fatty acids, which is like butyrate, propionate acetate, but predominantly butyrate, which most people use for the gut. but there's enormous amount of information showing that it calms down brain inflammation and turns down neuroinflammation. So it's really the gut-brain axis. But
Mm.
there's now been some clinical trials and studies with butyrate and MS, and it's mind-blowing. Go ahead.
And so we would normally produce large amounts of butyrate from bacteria in our gut from some of the foods we eat from digestion of fibers, but especially maybe in people with dysbiosis, they may not be producing adequate butyrate. And you're talking about using butyrate as a supplement.
Yeah. So you can use butyrate. You can get your own butyrate levels up by eating a high fiber meal or just taking fiber supplements, but you can also take exogenous butyrate. And for people that have a lot of serious inflammation, we'll definitely want them to do both.
Mm-hmm.
Exogenous butyrate is a game changer for some people.
Wow.
So myself, I take exogenous short chain fatty acids every morning, just because once you read all the papers, you can't ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the main things that just blocks down brain inflammation, which is not a common one that people think about. My second favorite is actually vinpocetine. Which is a botanical that increases endothelial nitric oxide and downregulates cytokine-inducible nitric oxide. So it helps get blood flow to the brain, but also dampens brain inflammation. And vinpocetine is a game changer too for a lot of people, especially if they have cold hands, cold feet, poor circulation. So I think those are the top two. And then, when you look at the rest, it's going to be the typical list: fish oils, resveratrol, turmeric, curcumin, pomegranate, polyphenols. That's the typical list, and those are for sure all therapeutic.
Mm-hmm. Are there any particular phytochemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier especially well? I know you mentioned that earlier.
The most research is on turmeric and resveratrol that cross the blood-brain barrier.
Is there any form of turmeric that you prefer, like Longvita or Mariva or Theracurmin or something like that?
The only thing that I've seen, there's no clear distinction between those that I've seen with the blood-brain barrier that make a big difference. So I don't have any preference. But as far as oral, you got to orally absorb it first. There's 2 papers now published that show liposomal liquid has 4 to 8 times more absorption.
Mm-hmm.
To use the liposomal liquid curcumin, because powdered curcumin is very hard to absorb.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only thing I could add to that.
Dr. Kharrazian, this has been phenomenal, brilliant as always. This is actually I just love talking to you and geeking out with you. I love being able to throw all kinds of questions at you and hear how you respond. So much amazing stuff here. I think these top 5 things are just critical, and I think the mental stimulation aspect of things is a game changer, even just for my own understanding. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with all of our listeners. If somebody's interested in following your work, where's the best place to do that, or reach out to work with you, or wherever you want to send them?
Sure. Dr. K News, drknews.com. Dr. K News is where we have all our articles and information.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, my friend. Great connecting with you as always.
Yeah, pleasure talking to you. As always.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next